Some good keen men. We'd lit a good fire and reveled in hot food and plenty of sleep for nearly a week before Jim arrived to see if we'd come down the river yet. By that time, we had completely recovered from our stay at the top camp, but Jack reckoned if he ever went back to that stinking hole, it would be in a coffin. Had a bit of dirty weather up there, Crumpy, said Jim. Just a bit, Jim. No more than a couple of months of it. Go on. Did you get the track finished? No, not quite, Jim. There's still a bit left to do. Oh well, as long as you've got it started, we can put a party in to finish it next winter. I wasn't going to be in that party if I could possibly help it. Jack left the job, and I filled in the last week of the winter helping Jim sort out gear for next summer's shooters and making a neat job of cutting all the surplus wood and metal off a new rifle. The fortnight in town that followed was a week too much, and I was glad to head back into the bush again. Jim said they were putting both my previous blocks in one this time, and would I like to have another go in there? It sounded a fair enough proposition to me, so I accepted. I aimed at getting at least 500 this time, as they'd cut out all the skinning, and were paying 10 shillings a tail. Besides, I knew where all the best places for deer were, or so I thought. I wasn't on the block very long before I began getting bored with shooting deer in exactly the same places as the year before. Almost everything I did was the same. I had 6 different mates, all good keen men, who each stayed a while and then quit the job for various reasons. Each time a new one arrived, I showed him how and where to get deer, how to bake bread, where the tracks and camps were, and usually wasted days with him. Then he'd leave, and I'd have to go through it all again with the next keen man Jim sent me. Clary came down the river with a dirty spring flood that carried him 50 yards past the hut on his last crossing. It beat me how he made it down from the top forks, where he dropped into the river head after coming across country from the main road. He hadn't come the usual way, because he hated walking on a road when he might get a deer in the bush. He was the queerest looking bloke I'd ever seen. He had a great mop of black hair that looked like a hawk's nest. He tied it back from his forehead in bunches with bits of flax. But the only other attention it ever got was when he occasionally tried to disentangle a bit of rimu leaf or manuka from it. Bush lawyer must have been his worst enemy, because it pulls hair out instead of breaking off. His trousers hung so low that the crutch of them hobbled him a bit when he walked. His elbows poked out of his old knitted jersey, and his arms didn't swing when he walked, but just sprang a bit at the elbows, as though he was just going to grab something. He wore no socks. "My name's Barry Crump," I said. "Jim, send you in." "Forget his name," he said. "But if you mean the talkin' bloke That's him." Few people talked less than Jim did, but this bloke was obviously one of them. "What's your name?" I asked. "I'll have to put you in the day book." "Clary." "Clary who?" "Just Clary." "Is it something Clary or Clary something?" "Clary anything you bloody well like," he said, though without being nasty about it. I put him down as Clary anything, and Clary anything he stayed for as long as I knew him. 3 weeks later he gave me a note Jim had given him for me when he started, with the observation that he wasn't a foot-slogging mailman anyway. The note invited me to see if I could make head or tail of this rooster. As far as Jim had been able to make out, his name was bloody well Clary, but if I was lucky enough to catch him in an unguarded moment and gain any further information on his name, next of kin, etc., Jim would appreciate my making a note of it for Clary's application form, which Jim had had to fill in himself because Clary wasn't much good at the writing caper. I never got to help Jim much with this because even a straight-out question wouldn't get you anywhere with Clary. For the month we hunted, from the hut and the center camp, the day's conversation would be like this. "Morning. Here. Ta. Porridge. It's in the big billy." "Where are you shooting?" "Left branch. What about you?" "Second creek on the left, down river." "Right. See you tonight." "Okay." Evening. "What you get?" "4 and 2 pigs." "What you get?" "6 and an okay." "What's in the oven?" "Stew." "Too much salt." "You're too well fed." "See you in the morning." "Right." And perhaps later, "Shut up there, Flynn. Get in behind, you noisy mongrel." Or a string of sleepy curses from Clary's bunk as he traced the ancestry of an insistent mosquito. After about 5 weeks, Clary went on a fly camp. He took salt and ammunition, his sleeping bag, and a small tin billy. He was away up the river for 14 days, but he came into the hut just after dark one night, as though he'd only been out for a bit of firewood. He'd got 2 more deer than I had for that fortnight, and must have been living under banks and logs like an old boar. But he reckoned it was worth it to get away on his own for a bit. One morning, when the mist was lifting up out of the gullies and creek beds, in dirty bundles like Romney fleeces, and I chopped the wood quietly because the loud echoes might scare away a handy deer. Clary stood looking at the sky outside the hut and scratching his chin with a sound like a rasp over dry timber. He was the sort of bloke who seemed to get 3 days' growth within a couple of hours of having a shave, and then stay that way for a week. Flynn rattled his chain as he got to his feet, and the whole valley seemed to stretch and yawn and wake uncertainly, as if it didn't really matter whether it woke or not. Smoke from the pole chimney leaned across to have a look at the skeleton of dead Rata, clung there for a time, and then joined the mist on its way into the still sky. Full daylight came, but the morning shoot had been poor lately, so we didn't rush about getting ready as we usually did. I spent a few minutes working out a good question to ask Clary, then inquired if the rats had run across his feet again in the night. He answered with an ear-splitting shrug. A question about how far up the left branch he'd got the day before yielded a reverberating 3 hours. When I asked if there was any fresh pig sign in there, he looked at me as if I was a nattering old woman, and moved his head in what could have been a nod, a shake, or my imagination. I had overused my ration of talk for the day. While we waited in silence for the billy to boil, I worked out that the most Clary had ever said at one time was when I'd asked him one day, just for something to say, if his name had been Clarence in the first place. I'd thought for a moment he was going to hang one on me. The idea of being called Clarence was evidently revolting to him. He insisted he'd been christened Clary. He brought up the subject about an hour later to make quite sure I believed him, so it had got his goat all right. I didn't really believe him, but I'd said I did just to make him feel happy. I'd scared a few words out of him anyway, which was all I'd set out to do. A month of this was harder on my nerves than the previous 6 weeks on my own, though Clary seemed quite unaffected by the limited conversational life we were having. He never noticed I was busting for a decent yarn session and wasn't in the least interested in my efforts to break through his taciturnity. I guessed only that Clary was going off for another bit of a look round, when, while I was cleaning out the camp oven one morning, he tied the bottoms of his trousers in his bootlaces, and poked all his gear into the old skin bag he used for a pack. Everything he owned weighed about 40 pounds, but he wiped out his mug and plate on the leg of his pants, stuffed them into his bag, and looked up. "You can tell your noisy mate," he said, meaning Jim, I suppose, "that I don't go much on the idea of pokin' round in one bit of bush all the time. You could have hunted for a solid month on that block, and never covered the same country twice." But Clary felt confined. "You mean you're leaving the job, Clary?" "Yeah." "What about your pay?" "You'd better hang on to it." But it was no use. "Well, goodbye, Clary." Clary grunted something under his breath, stepped out of the hut as casually as he'd first come into it, and headed off up the river. I heard the faint talk of a rifle shot somewhere at the head of the valley next afternoon, and that was all. My next mate was a Maori named Maury, who was so keen on cooking and eating weird things he never had time to become much of a hunter. All the shooting he did was for food, and once he had enough to keep him in grease for a while, he lost interest in the job. He drowned everything he cooked in deep layers of fat, and swore that it saves you from getting the crook guts boy. When I filled in the day book, I'd asked Maury for his tally, and he'd reply, "Found a beauty hoo-hoo log boy, or caught a beauty eel. Sometimes it was a beauty trout, or a beauty fat pig. I once found him tearing a rotten log to pieces, scattering powdery wood all over the place as he searched for hoo-hoos. When he found one, he'd pick the butter-colored grub out with his fingers and eat it as it was. And if I came upon a pig's carcass lying in the bush, with the head and feet and the insides missing, I'd be certain to find Maury back at camp, hovering lovingly over a blood-pudding writhing in a camp oven of grease, while pigs, trotters, brains, and tongue stood ready to hand in the tea-billy. He cooked a possum stew in which you had to probe through a couple of inches of grease to get at the meat, and eel pie that looked like a miniature mud pool in the bottom of the camp oven. Often I was driven to frying myself a steak in the billy lid, which suited Maury because he could clean up my share of his own creation for breakfast next morning. I managed once to gulp half a dozen hoo-hoos, with mouthfuls of tea to drown the woody taste, just to prove to Maury I wasn't squeamish. I was almost ill for about an hour afterwards, a condition that wasn't improved by listening to Maury eat. He sounded like a cocky in gumboots, walking through the mud behind his cowshed. On a wet Sunday, Maury baked a few rounds of Maori bread. They were about the same shape as the wooden cart wheels in old drawings, and I doubt if they tasted much better. The tripe stew he made for tea that night was too much for me. I talked him into trying his culinary hand at a simple steak and kidney stew with no fat. He obliged, but somehow the taste of hoo-hoo's tripe, blood pudding, and possum had stuck with our only camp oven. Maury didn't seem to notice, or perhaps he didn't mind. He was always first back to camp, and there was usually some delicacy or other well under way by the time I got there. The hut stank like a meat works. After 2 weeks of Maury's cooking, I was determined to have a decent feed, so I insisted on having the camp oven left empty for me one night. I filled it with water and boiled it for an hour to get rid of the residue of fat and possum, then prepared an ordinary stew, meat, spuds, onions, split peas, and just plain water. I had to keep swiping at Maury's hand with the knife to discourage his well-meant additions of lumps of fat and leftovers he took from tins cached about the hut. He looked as miserable as a wet dog, circling around and shyly suggesting this or that to thicken her up a bit, eh? I got the stew safely cooked, but damn me if it still didn't taste, faintly, of Maury's previous handiwork. He enjoyed it less than I did, though. "Can't taste it, boy," he said. "Maury would have been good to live with if our taste had been more compatible, but no amount of trying was ever going to make me prefer boiled pig's eyes to a good feed of steak and spuds." Flynn was having a lean time too, because all the scraps he usually got were being consumed by Maury. He even smashed bones with the back of an axe to get at the marrow. Any housewife with a Maury under her sink could have got by with a small billy for garbage. No disposal unit yet invented could equal him. He'd eat anything, provided it was covered with an adequate layer of fat. I made several efforts to convince him we weren't shooting animals solely for their fat, but he always considered a pig more worthwhile than a deer. Once he actually let a deer get away in case the sound of his shot alarmed a young pig he was tracking. I'd have liked Jim to see his good keen man that time, but as it turned out, I was only beginning to worry about getting ulcers from the cooking when Maury did run into Jim. It was in the river bed, and Maury was licking his chops over a brace of pigeons he'd just shot. He had been warned about forbidden game when Jim had caught him once before tickling trout, so this time he got the bullet. Jim always gave a man the option of leaving or getting the sack, but the result was the same, and as final as death. Exit another good keen man. He'd got 43 deer and 35 pigs in the 6 weeks he'd been on the job. Twice as many pigs and half as many deer as I'd got in the same period. It was some weeks before I got all the traces of Maury's cooking boiled out of the camp oven and the billies, and though I aired it well, the hut reeked for a long time. I found what looked like a mixture of fat and pigskin wrapped in paper under the grass mattress on the bunk Maury had been using. I think he must have left it there to mature, or in case he got hungry in the night. Even the dogs wouldn't eat it. Maury got a job at the public works camp down the valley, but I only saw him twice after that. I heard he was wallowing happily in fat from possums he found on his way to work in the mornings. There were always a few run over by cars during the night, and Maury was doing all right on them. Bless his greasy heart. Next came Alf, who was addicted to knife throwing and whistling, neither of which he did well. For the first week he hung about the camp, throwing his knife at the chimney or sticking it into the walls or the floor, trees or banks. He'd whip out his knife and hurl it at anything that happened to catch his eye, no matter what he was supposed to be doing at the time. It wasn't long before this and a few of his other unpleasant habits had him classed as an idiot as far as my opinion went. One evening I came home after a particularly hard and profitless day to find the fire out, no wood cut, and every billy in the place a filthy mess. Alf had been busy practicing all day while I cleaned up and put a feed on to cook. He took advantage of the last daylight to brush up on his underarm throw. I was just lifting the spud billy off the fire when Alf's knife flew through a gap in the chimney and narrowly missed my face. "Did you see where that went?" he called cheerfully. That did it. I grabbed the knife off the floor, took it to the door, and flung it as far into the bush as I could. "Alfred, old boy," I said, If I ever see you throw a knife round this camp again, I'll cut your throat with it." We ate our meal in silence, and after that Alf used his eating knife on his infrequent and barren hunting excursions. He left the job soon after, with a tally of 2 tails to go share milking with his brother. He reckoned there were no deer on the block, but I'd got more than 30 in the 2 weeks he was there. Jim had thought him a keen-looking bloke. There followed a month on my own, during which I stayed away from the hut as much as possible in case Jim brought another good man. I creamed all the best places on the tops and up the valley, so I wouldn't have to share the easy deer with anyone. I was getting 25 to 30 a week. Then Philip arrived. Jim brought him up the river and told me on the quiet that if he didn't turn out any better than Alf, I was to send him out to the road hut for supplies in 2 weeks' time. Somebody would be there to take him back to town, but if he didn't turn up, they'd know he was doing all right. Philip was a quiet sort of bloke who seemed to live in a trance from which it was often difficult to rouse him. I'd be explaining something to him, realize he wasn't listening, and have to start over again. He didn't know any good yarns either, and as a cook he was a dead loss. He'd forget to watch the tucker, or to throw a bit of wood on the fire, and the feed would be either late or burnt. Our camp oven had a bent handle, and one night Philip asked me how to stop it from tilting to one side all the time. I told him to put a rock on it, whereupon he absent-mindedly lifted the lid and dropped a filthy ash-covered rock from beside the fireplace into the stew. Once he got lost in the bush up the river, and I had to go looking for him in the dark, with a candle in a tin for a torch. I was guided in his direction by his frantic shooting and yelling, and found him sitting on a log 20 minutes away from camp. He'd been rushing about in the bush like a lunatic, and was covered with sweat and mud and bruises. He gasped out his pleasure at seeing me, made sure I knew the way back to camp, and collapsed back on the log. I let him have a spell for a few minutes to catch his wind, then led him home. He trod on my heels all the way, terrified lest he should lose me again. He was still sleeping off his ordeal next morning, so I left him some steak and rice in the oven, and a note advising him to stick to the river bed when he went out that day. I worked through a few creek heads, and returned in the evening to find Philip still fast asleep. He hadn't even been up for a meal. I woke him, gave him a mug of tea, and told him there'd be a feed ready in a few minutes. He drank half the tea and went back to sleep, mumbling that he wasn't hungry. So I left him in peace and ate on my own. Next morning I again roused him with a brew, which he sat up and drank. He said he wasn't crook or anything, but was asleep again within 5 minutes. I left his food on the table and went out to hunt some more creek heads. When I got back that night, Philip was still asleep, and I became a bit worried about him. I made him get up and eat a feed of spuds and meat, but he was so tired and dopey that I had to let him hit the sack again. If I couldn't rouse this bloke tomorrow, I decided I'd better get him down to the road before he kicked the bucket or something and had to be carried out. Next morning I woke him, fed him, and told him he was to come up the river with me for a bit of shooting. He perked up at once and became almost enthusiastic. He'd been sleeping for 2 days and 3 nights, which little effort earned him the nickname of Sleeping Beauty. We traveled up river for about 15 minutes, then cut across a low ridge into the head of a side creek, where I'd found some good spots for deer a few weeks before. Philip was as slow as a gut-shot pig, and started yelling as soon as he lost sight of me through the bush. I slowed down to a pace I could have beaten on one leg so that he could keep up, though his clumsy, crashing method of travel was nearly as bad as his shooting. I found a hind in a small clearing and was just sneaking up for a shot when Philip yelled, "Look!" I dropped the hind on the run with a lucky shot, but I took Philip back down to the river bed, where the going was easier, and I could keep a better eye on him. Walking along the flats, I heard a couple of clicks behind me, and told him we weren't likely to get on to anything yet, so it was no use loading his rifle. There was more clicking, then more and more. "Just put it on half-cock and leave it there, Phil," I said. "You won't be using it for a while." But he couldn't leave the thing alone. Half-cock, full-cock, bolt open, bolt closed, loaded, unloaded, bullet up the spout, back in the magazine, and he was pointing it all over the place. I was so nervous after half an hour of this that I took possession of his bolt, for fear of copping a bullet in the back. "I'll give this back to you when we reach the forks," I said. From then on he contented himself with pumping the rounds up and down in the magazine with his finger. When I saw a stag feeding on a slip about 200 yards ahead of us, I gave Philip his bolt and told him to see if he could sneak up and bowl it. There was a complicated series of loud clickings, and then he fired from where he was standing. I had been just forward and to one side of him, and was nearly knocked over by the muzzle blast. The deer ran unharmed into the bush. "Do you think I got him?" he asked. "Just missed," I said, reaching for his bolt. "You'll strain the barrel of your rifle if you try shooting at such long ranges." Philip carefully examined his rifle for signs of barrel strain, and said he'd be more careful in future. We saw 4 more deer that day. I got my 2, but Philip missed both of his through getting excited and blazing away as soon as he saw them. I could see his shots hitting branches or scattering dirt as far as 4 feet away from the deer. I also had to explain that there was no need to pump an extra shot or 2 into a deer once it was kicking on the ground. He was so tired by the end of the day that I had to carry his rifle for him. He was too weary even to click it any more. Philip never slept for more than 2 days at a stretch after that, but he was so scared of getting lost again that he wouldn't leave sight of the camp unless I was with him. When his 2 weeks were up, I told him we had to go out to the road for more ammunition, and took him down there in easy stages. Jim arrived, and between us we convinced Philip he wasn't going to make a successful shooter. He must have been grateful for the chance to return to his old job in the wool stores, because he didn't take much persuading. I spent a month on the tops after that, and then shifted down into the valley on the other side of the range. It was much the same as the side I'd come from, except that there was a road into it, and the river was smaller, the deer scarcer, and the weather worse. I was joined there by Frank, complete with a good, keen man recommendation, and an intimate knowledge of how to do your shopping after hours, and the best ways to open hut doors when you'd lost the key. He was called for after only 2 days' residence in the road hut, by 2 blokes in a black car, who took him into town to explain what he was doing with some cameras and watches they dug out of his suitcase. The 6th mate I had that season was called Dave. He arrived just before the roar, with 2 expensive rifles, with telescopic sights and special ammunition, leather-handled sheath knives, too, a movie camera, and several £100 worth of other useless gear. What he wasn't going to do to the deer wasn't worth doing. He sat around the camp getting everything ready for 4 days, and then made 1 trip up to the tops and back with me. He fired about 80 rounds at tins and stumps, missed 5 deer, and then returned to town for a lighter rifle, never to return. Dave was the only shooter I ever knew who had a flash car and an old man with 2 butcher's shops. I meet Harry. The weeks dragged slowly by, and I determined never to return again to a block that I'd already spent a season on. It was too depressing. I was going to get my 500 deer, but I didn't reckon it was any more than I'd have got in another block. To hell with the blasted place, as far as I was concerned. I began to feel about it the same way I'd felt about Jack when we'd got weather-bound in the winter. The same old features day after day. I knew them all, and each day liked them less. Jim arrived at the hut one night and said would I like to come into town with him next morning. He was meeting a new shooter at the railway station in the afternoon. I was pleased to have a break, and turned into my bunk feeling rather like a kid at the start of the holidays. I haven't seen this bloke yet, Jim said next day, but by the sound of his letter he's a good, keen enough chap. Done a fair bit of private shooting down south. You shouldn't have much trouble with him, Crumpy. I said nothing. A fairly successful shave, a wash, and a change of clothes, and I was ready to go. We arrived in town much too early to meet the train, and Jim said he had a few hours' work to do at the office. If you like, he said, You can take the truck while you're filling in time and meet your new mate yourself at 2 o'clock. Name's Harry Trail. I'll be able to get a bit of work out of the way. Then meet you for a beer before we go back to the block, and don't go getting yourself into trouble. I had a job getting the truck started, and it was late by the time I got to the railway station to meet Mr. Trail, up the end where they dump all the luggage and boxes, where 3 train-weary dogs jealously guarding a sugar bag of gear and a pair of split boots. Only a shooter's dog would consider such a pile of stuff worth looking after. I waited around for several minutes before deciding that the pub was the best place to have a look for my mate. The dogs wanted to stay where they were and seemed to think the bag and the boots should stay with them, so I left them for later and took off to the Boozer. The public bar had nothing to offer in the way of shooters, and the owner of the sugar bag wasn't likely to be in any other part of the establishment. So I got myself a beer and settled down to wait. My second visit out the back convinced me that someone behind one of the half-closed doors wasn't enjoying the best of health. I had a look and found my mate, sprawled on the floor with his head resting on the seat. I shook him conscious, but it was a job even to get him to admit who he was. I cleaned him up a bit, and a Maori bloke I'd met in the bar gave me a hand to cart him out to the truck. Mr. Trail was really crook, and the only thing he was keen about just then was flaking out. They wouldn't let me take him into the cafe, so I took him out a brew of black coffee, which pulled him round long enough for him to get his dogs on board. Then we picked up Jim and headed off to the block, with Harry drooling and groaning across the seat beside me. It was dark when we got to the hut, and while Harry tied his dogs up, Jim and I lit the fire and threw a few spuds in the big billy. After a feed, Harry dug into his sugar bag and came up with a prehistoric specimen of a sleeping bag, crawled into one of the larger holes in it, and passed out again. I liked the look of Harry and had an idea that we were going to get on okay. He had all the earmarks of a real good bloke. I said so to Jim, but it was his turn to say nothing. As it turned out, Harry worked with the same whole-hearted enthusiasm with which he drank beer. He was a good, keen man, all right. He'd get a craze for something, and it would completely obsess him for a few days. Then he'd suddenly lose interest in it. 2 days after he got there, he decided that the capture of a live fawn was the most important thing to which he could turn his hand. He'd come into camp in the evening, covered with scratches and bruises, and excitedly reenact some desperate chase down a gully after a fawn that always just managed to get away. He gave up the idea after 3 days, for which I was privately thankful. There's no greater nuisance than a fawn hanging round the camp. Once we'd had the season before had dragged all our socks off the string above the fire and burnt the lot. He just about crippled us for life. A week after the fawn fixation, nothing could compete with pig hunting for Harry's attention. His dogs were fed at such frequent intervals, they started getting pot-bellied. I was thoroughly interrogated every morning as to the whereabouts of any fresh pig sign I had seen that day, and in return received a demonstrative commentary on a day of vigorous pig chasing. This particular obsession lasted until the trout started to run up the river to spawn, and Harry decided to catch himself a 10-pound rainbow. His day became an amazing mixture of work and fishing. He'd carry his manuka rod in one hand and his rifle in the other, dropping down to the river every now and then for a bit of fishing, then climbing the ridge again to continue hunting. He brought in some really big fish too, but he never got his 10-pounder until he discovered the advantages of using hoo-hoo grubs for bait. Where Harry got all his energy from was a source of constant wonder to me. A long day of gut-busting work never even slowed him down, and when it was too dark to pursue his current obsession, he'd pace up and down the hut, regaling me with exaggerations of his numerous experiences. He was never undecided about anything. He didn't give himself time to think twice, and if Harry handled the truth a little carelessly at times, it was wholly due to his enthusiastic nature. Only once did this man of infinite zest show signs of flagging. An article in a Reader's Digest had convinced him that there was a fortune in gold waiting to be panned from the river up near our top camp, and he assaulted the river bed with the aluminum basin and his usual energetic extravagance. Wet to the armpits and blue with the cold from the icy water, he swilled his way through tons of sandy gravel without the slightest glimmer of success. I became so alarmed for his health that I suggested a quick trip back to the hut to see if there was any mail for him, and was greatly relieved when he agreed that it was a fair enough idea. Harry's behavior when he received a letter from his mother was worth seeing. I suspect she was a real Kiwi mom, with a soft spot for her little Harry. As soon as he got the letter, he became furtive and quiet, as though he'd been entrusted with a mighty secret, and crept off to his bunk, laboriously absorbing the mysterious contents and looking up like a startled hind every now and then to make sure no one was looking. Having performed this embarrassing rite, he scribbled a half-page reply and left it in the mail tin to be posted. Then, with an air of great relief, he recovered his usual boisterous high spirits and began to entertain visions of a bomb in which 100 rounds of .303 ammunition were detonated simultaneously. This was to be thrown amongst mobs of deer, killing them all in a most sensational manner. A crazy-looking device made of wire and a length of my good cleaning rod was quickly under construction. This was to be fitted to the end of Harry's rifle for the purpose of launching the revolutionary missile. A detonator was supplied by a meat-hungry mill worker, and I started getting a bit worried. I tried to point out that it was impossible to set off all that ammunition with one detonator, and that he was loopy even to try doing it. He told me that that was what they'd said to Edison, and continued working on the thing far into the night. The ammunition was packed tightly into a bag with the detonator in the middle, and a length of fuse hanging out the end. The bomb weighed about 15 pounds, and was far too heavy to throw a safe distance away, so I persuaded him to try dropping the thing over a cliff for the first time. We took it up the road where there was a steep drop into the river. With great ceremony the fuse was lit, and the bomb thrown over the side. It sailed down and hit the water with a very satisfactory splash, sinking in a trail of bubbles. Harry leapt back and flattened himself against the bank on the far side of the road in preparation for the terrific upheaval that was about to take place. There was a slight disturbance on the surface of the water when the detonator went off a few seconds later, and I informed Harry that he had just thrown 100 rounds into the river without even having had the satisfaction of seeing them explode. It would take him a month to make up the loss. The subject of Harry's bomb was never again referred to by us. We hunted from the hut for a while, but were back again at the camp up the river when Harry decided to try his hand at jacking up a new home brew. Frustrated, no doubt, by 2 weeks of mere deer shooting, he commandeered the big camp oven and proceeded to mix one of the vilest concoctions I had ever seen. Nothing was spared: tea leaves and sugar, raisins, dates, and Worcester sauce, curry, salt, and mixed herbs, cocoa, porridge, and onions. And when he'd exhausted all the raw materials the camp had to offer, Harry scoured through the bush like a hungry kiwi, gathering tawa and microberries, and a number of unidentified and suspicious-looking bits of herbage. All these were stirred into a revolting mess in the camp oven. 6 days later, I had to insist that the brew be taken well downwind from the camp and disposed of. I was usually game to try pretty near anything in the way of original alcoholic creations, but Harry himself had to admit that this little brew would rot your bootlaces. He started to wonder if he should have used more sugar, but I was getting worried about the hole he was making in our stores. We took off for the tops before he could start to translate any more brewing theories into action. One night, shortly after Harry and I arrived back at the base hut for a spell, a Land Rover came bouncing down the track, driven by one of the search and rescue blokes. He was recruiting everyone he could get hold of to help look for a party of students who'd been tramping farther down the range and had not arrived at their destination. Would we help? Neither of us was keen, but we said we'd give a hand. Grabbing our packs, we climbed into the back of the Land Rover and were driven off to spend the night in an old house from which the search was to begin at daylight. Harry thought the whole thing a great joke, and made no bones about letting everybody know it. As far as he was concerned, he said the bludgers could stay lost if they didn't have the sense to follow a creek until they hit a farm or the road. There were 6 of them, and it was most unlikely they were all injured and unable to walk. However, the search and rescue people took the whole thing seriously, watching the sky anxiously in case the weather should break, and organizing everyone into parties. They pored over maps and fretted loudly about the safety of the missing men. Harry, who was trying to get a bit of sleep, yelled out from the next room that he bet there wasn't one of them who wasn't getting a big kick out of it, and he, Harry, would be the least disappointed of all when the students turned up next day and said they'd decided to stay out an extra day or 2. We shooters weren't very popular that night. Next morning, the 16 of us were split into 4 groups, Harry and myself leading 3 men each. Harry displayed a most insensitive interest in the amount of deer sign there was around, and became separated from the rest of his party on the first suitable ridge he came to. I heard a bit of shooting during the day from over where he was supposed to be searching. I sent my men, who were more likely to lose themselves than find lost trampers, up and down a branch of the stream looking for boot prints, while I searched a side creek for deer. I got 4. Late in the afternoon, I met my men again, found they'd seen exactly as many lost trampers as I had, and we climbed back up to the road. Everybody had returned to the starting point, with the exception of Harry. One of the parties had spent the day trailing the footprints of Harry's leaderless party, which in turn had been heading towards the sound of my shots. One bloke staggered in late after having tried to catch up with Harry all day. He was probably beat. Nobody had seen or heard anything of the lost trampers. When someone suggested that Harry had found them and was rendering assistance before coming back to base, they all took up the idea and watched the track, getting lanterns ready and organizing first aid gear. I said nothing. After several false alarms, someone said, "Here he comes," and everybody hurried out to meet him. "That you, Harry?" someone called into the dark. "Yes," answered Harry. "How did you get on?" Everybody listened for the answer. "Got 6 and wounded 2, said Harry, grinning happily as he came into the lamplight. "I'd have got a few more if I'd had the time." There was a rather unpleasant silence, into which Harry dropped an afterthought. "By the way, how did you blokes get on with your search?" Not long afterwards, news came that the lost party had arrived at the forestry headquarters during the afternoon. It did little to lighten the atmosphere in which we were driven back to our hut and dumped with our packs in the darkness. The driver muttered a curt word of thanks. "That's okay," said Harry. "No trouble at all. Any time you want a hand, just sing out." A week after that, the season ended, and Harry went north promising to write and let me know how things were going. I swore solemnly to answer. Not a word was ever written or received